Welcome, I'm Chris Morrow from the North Shire Bookstore. Thank you for joining us. We're here today to talk with Judith Schwartz for her new book, Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, this is congratulations on the book that came out this week.
Thank you.
A fascinating book that can inspire farmers, homesteaders, and hopefully policymakers worldwide. Can you tell us about the genesis of the book? How did you get started with this?
How did I get here? Well, a few years ago, I wrote a book about soil. I know, which is in itself kind of improbable for a suburban-raised journalist. So that book was Cows Save the Planet, and that was a look at soil as a hub for many environmental, economic, and social crises, and for solutions. And there was a chapter in that book on water, and the material in that chapter just kind of stayed with me in a couple of ways. So one thing that kind of blew me away was an understanding of the connection between climate change and water. So when we hear about the connection between water and climate change, it always tends to go in one direction, namely that with climate change, there's going to be additional stresses on water sources throughout the world, and certainly that is a real concern. But what we don't hear about is the effect that water has on climate. And my research for the first book brought me to a whole group of thinkers, namely a group from Eastern Europe, who wrote this extraordinary little book called Water for the Recovery of the Climate. And when you think about it, it really makes sense that water is basically 95% of all the phenomenon that we call climate is driven by hydrological processes. Mm-hmm. So moisture is moving continually across the landscape and through the atmosphere, and as it moves through the atmosphere through evaporation, transpiration, and condensation, it is conveying heat. And we can work with natural processes to promote cooling and influence how all that heat moves.
Mm-hmm. So I know one of your motivations for the book was to connect water and the water cycles with climate change, as you just said. So give us a concrete example of one way that can happen. We can change our use of water to impact the climate.
Okay, all right, so this connects to the other reason how the soil book led me to the water book. All right, so when we hear about, and this will connect to climate, trust me. All right, so when we hear about our water problems, such as the California drought, which was in full throttle when I was beginning to write this book, our focus is always on water that comes down from the sky. And what we don't talk about is land degradation. Okay, because when you have degraded landscapes, that land is not holding water. So I kept getting frustrated because I had been focusing on soil, and so much of the fate of our water has to do with the quality of the soil, because when you have rich soil, that soil is holding water. When you have degraded landscapes, whether they've been over-farmed, whether they've been over-grazed, whether they're covered up by concrete, all that land is not holding water. So, okay, so we've got that little piece now. Mm-hmm. But one reason that connects to climate is if you have degraded land, you have land that is not covered by plants, or you have concrete, when solar radiation hits the surface of the earth, whether it's ground or the built environment, then you get sensible heat. When you have this solar radiation descending on a forest or on a meadow, what you have is transpiration, which disperses heat. It disperses solar radiation. I mean, we all know the difference between walking on a sidewalk on a really hot summer day, or walking through a meadow or through the woods.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually has a lot to do with climate on many, many levels. And I think that it's really important to start making those connections and to really understand how plants manage heat.
Fascinating. So you mentioned, in the book you go all over the world, but you just mentioned California, so let's start there. I think for many Easterners, we're not really aware of the degree to which they have a water infrastructure, which is incredible, and the water laws and how they're moving, how Southern California is more or less a desert environment, right? That they've...
Yes and no. What's really interesting about Southern California is, okay, so we think about Los Angeles as this big megacity, as it is today. But in the past, before we built it up, before Hollywood, it was basically wetlands. So you have like where the airport is, those were all wetlands. So that was really important to that area. So it was kind of, you could call it high desert and with wetlands. So it was a whole different water scenario than we have now. And I think one thing that's worth understanding is that as people created cities, the goal when it came to water, the goal was just to dispense with water. That water was a nuisance. So we didn't build our cities with an understanding of how we might maintain the water, harvest the water. It was just get rid of it, and then when we needed it, we would bring it in. Right. Because we had all these technologies, or we developed all these technologies. But it is crazy in California because you have so much energy that's used to bring water in, and then you have water that's supporting, in hydropower, supporting the energy. So you just have all this spinning of wheels without making use of the water that you do get naturally.
Right. But there's some interesting work being done out there on...
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Okay, right. So I'm pretty sure, I just saw some references to this, that they are beginning to work with some of the coastal areas to restore some of the wetlands. And that's really important because that filters water, that builds carbon-rich soils, it creates a buffer. And also the LA River. I didn't really understand what was meant by the LA River until I took a train ride up from the San Diego area to Los Angeles, and there's this big concrete channel, and that's because there was a river and they channelized it, they controlled it, but now, which meant that the water didn't touch the land. But now what they're doing is they're trying to restore the river to a more natural state so that you get the flows, you get water in contact with the soil and enriching the soil, and you get wetlands, and you get reeds, and you get all those plants that have a function in maintaining the water cycle.
Right, right. So the book, one of the things I liked about it is that it is a very hopeful book. It's aptly subtitled, and there's lots of stories. The whole book is basically stories about people who are regenerating the land and commitment to the land, and tremendous ingenuity from around the world in how people are finding ways to harness the water in the natural cycles. So it's really fun to read about all these people doing such interesting things. So you start with the story of Alan Savory in Zimbabwe. So can you tell me a little bit about him and his work?
Okay, yeah, Alan is a pretty extraordinary character, and the more I get to know him, the more amazed I am, and especially the chance to spend time with him in Zimbabwe. So he's a wildlife ecologist, kind of philosopher of sorts, and he's 80 years old now, and he grew up in what was then Rhodesia. he always loved animals, and his goal was to work with the wildlife that he adored. So what happened with him was that when he was in his 20s, he became a park ranger. And down there in southern Africa, they were establishing the national parks. And he was aware that the wildlife had suffered, that the herds weren't as large, the predator population wasn't as vibrant, and he wondered why. And so with him and his colleagues, what they decided, because at the same time, while the wildlife was languishing slightly, the land was deteriorating. So they decided, well, it must be that the land needs to rest. Maybe there are too many animals for this land. Why don't we set aside the land and keep animals away, and then it will rebound and then be able to support more wildlife again. And what happened was, when they removed the animals from the land deteriorated. And this made no sense if the problem was that there were too many animals, and then you remove them and the land gets worse. So he took this as a challenge to understand why this was happening. And over many decades, he came to understand that grasslands, we're talking about, this is savanna in southern Africa, that grasslands and grazing animals co-evolved so that the land needs the animals in the same way that the animals need the land. And over time, and he also came to understand that with the encroachment of more human populations, that it was changing the dynamic. Mm-hmm. So he developed an approach to working with domestic animals that mimics the movement of the great herds so that they would restore the land. And this is called holistic management, or the actual application with grazing animals, holistic planned grazing. And I saw in Zimbabwe how a river, through using cattle, that the Dimbengombe River now extends a full kilometer higher than it had in living memory. I walked along that river. There are now reeds, there are now sedges, there are now fish eagles and other forms of wildlife that depend on continual flow of a river. And I also saw that, I heard the story and I saw the area that there was that there had only been one pool where the elephants could water, and elephants like to wallow in water and they like to take mud baths. But during the dry season, there had only been one permanent pool. But now, because they've restored the water cycle, there are many places where the elephants can frolic and play. And just two other quick things about what I saw in Zimbabwe. One is that the wildlife has rebounded, as I mentioned, and one thing that really, really struck me was seeing these large herds of sable antelope, which are beautiful, stately antelope that have returned and are really thriving in that environment, because I know that in many of the southern African game parks, sable antelope are not doing well. And also moving to people. I mean, I could stay on wildlife all day, but people too, people matter too. And I spent some time in some villages that they had been working with, and these people were so grateful and so proud of what they've accomplished working with the Africa Center for Holistic Management, because they've been, by being able to keep more moisture on the landscape, they've been able to grow food and get off food aid. They'd only had a really short period where they could grow food, but because their crop fields are able to hold moisture and have fertile soil because of the animal impact, they're able to get off food aid. They're able to send their children to school again, which they couldn't when the children were undernourished. Right.
So it's really all connected.
It's all connected.
You also, closer to home, you traveled to Amish country and spent some time with a young rebel farmer named John Kempf. What is he up to?
He is also an extraordinary figure. He's still in his 20s, so he's someone, we could not take photographs of him because he's Amish, and you know, that's part of their practice.
Mm-hmm.
And he does not fly, again, because that's part of his practice. However, this is someone who is on the phone continually with people at the UN, major investors in regenerative agriculture. I mean, he's really a big player in the world. He is working on, he's someone that I really like the way he thinks, because rather than focusing on what doesn't work, when he had a problem with some crops and then there were some other crops nearby that were doing well, he said, what is working well with those other crops, which led him to understand, I mean, he's still in the process of learning to understand, he's still exploring how you get robust plants, what makes for healthy plants. And this relates to water, because healthy plants use water more efficiently. And this is really important to know, because we talk a lot about water in all of our croplands, whether it's in the Midwest or in California. We're concerned about having the water to grow the crops that we all depend on.
Right.
So whether the plants are using water effectively, whether the water that they're using is of good quality, and that matters because you need more water. If the water isn't of good quality, for example, if you're getting salt buildup, you need to flush out all that salt, and that's a tremendous use of water. So, and also, whether you have land that is carbon rich, whether you're building carbon in that soil, for every 1% increase in soil organic carbon, you're able to hold 20,000 gallons of water per acre. And that matters, because if you're holding that water on the soil, you don't need to put on as much water because it's already available to the plants.
Right, right. And so we have agricultural universities across the country, you know, and what is this 20-something Amish guy discovering that we don't know, we haven't known in the past? Or is it just a question of relearning how the natural cycles work and not focusing so much on artificial inputs and that sort of thing?
Very much the latter. So he's a consultant, so he's just, the reason that everyone's calling him all the time is that he and his company have had tremendous results. So people are coming to him continually. But basically what he is able to say is that in order to have healthy plants, we cannot be dousing them with chemicals, because that undermines the biological system on which the whole growing of plants is based.
Right.
So it's a shift from looking at crops from a chemistry standpoint to a biology standpoint. And I see more and more people going in that direction.
Right. Well, that's a good sign. So you also go to the Indian desert state of Rajasthan a little bit, Rajendra Singh.
I didn't go there, but I did have the chance to meet Rajendra Singh.
Bit.
Yes.
What is he up to?
He's also, I keep saying this, I mean, I had such a gift of meeting these extraordinary characters. So Rajendra Singh was a young doctor, and he went to this really remote, desolate, dry area in India to be a doctor there. And he realized, you know, bringing my medical skills will only take these people so far. What they're really suffering from is a lack of water, and which of course affects their health and affects their ability to grow food that's nourishing and all that. So he went all out. He brought back some, or introduced people to some traditional means of harvesting water. And over time, they have been able to bring back springs and rivers. And he's also been able to teach local people to share these very, very simple technologies. When I say technology, I mean that in the most basic of terms, a means of influencing the environment, of holding the water. So there's nothing high-tech about it, but they are technologies nonetheless. And he also is very much a water activist. He won the Stockholm Water Prize last year, 2015, and he makes the point that we can't really, that water is a human right, and we can't just pay lip service to that. We really have to help people find water in their own landscapes for peace, for health, for basic, human justice.
Right. Well, that segues into a topic that I wanted to get to because I found it fascinating. And it's a topic that I don't hear people talking about in relation to water, which is condensation. You have a whole chapter talking about how some really innovative folks out west are harnessing just condensation from natural processes to support their water needs in an otherwise very dry environment. So is this just under the radar, or totally underutilized source of water?
Yes, I think that what I learned from this couple, this is in far west Texas, an area called Terlingua. It's right on the edge of Big Bend National Park, which is beautiful. We were there in high summer. It was hot and very, very dry. And everyone that we met down there was shaking their heads and saying, the lack of water is going to get us. But this couple and the people that kind of pass through their operation and work with them, and they kind of have co-housing and all kinds of interesting things happening there. Basically what they've done is, so you think there's no water, but they have arranged their dwelling, what they call their rain barn, and actually live in a former Katrina trailer.
Yeah.
So what happens is that you get the top roof, the top layer of roof, you have galvanized metal, and that heats up. And then as the day cools and you get breezes coming through in the evening, you have moisture air, and the temperature differential makes it so that you have condensation, particularly at night. And they capture that condensation and they fix it up so that they capture some that their chickens make use of and the bees, and then they capture it in a water tank. And they had no idea just how much they were collecting until one day, I think it was 3 or 4 months after the most recent rain, the water tank overflowed. So they do have a community, and they alerted me to this, the fact that there's a whole group of people that are out there reviving the desert, that are off the radar. They're experimenting with ways of doing this, but there is a community that does this. But yet, is it underutilized? Absolutely. It takes time. This Marcus, who organized, who put all this together, he's very much a tinkerer. And someone, he's very creative, and he said that he took inspiration from the Namib desert beetle, which lives in a landscape that gets almost no water, almost no rainfall, but is able to kind of lift up its legs, do a kind of handstand, and capture moisture. So it rolls down its belly and the beetle is able to drink. I mean, it's amazing when you start to ask questions like, how does this work in nature?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of biomimicry going on. So in the few minutes we have left, do you see some of these examples that you give scaling up or being proliferating around the world? Are we ready to use water in a different way going forward, do you think?
I think so. One big challenge is making sure that more people are aware of this, because I think that we tend to look at our landscapes and think that it's always been that way. And I mean that, that many of our landscapes are diminished, right, and we don't realize how lush they can be. So I really hope that people are able to use their imaginations to imagine what is possible. But very much this is happening. There's a growing movement of regenerative agriculture that's scaling up all over the world, and that I just find so incredibly hopeful. But it is a matter of getting more people aware of it, more people aware of the hopefulness of what is possible if we act upon the land in a way that brings back our landscapes. That actually, I'll offer this final note. What Catherine, who lives in far west Texas, and she was my example there. She and her husband Marcus, is that she said that we can be the beavers on the landscape, and beavers are often looked up to as keystone species, nature's engineers that maintain wetlands and maintain moisture and keep our landscapes hydrated. We can be the beavers in the landscapes. We can make choices about how we do things that will make our landscapes lush, bring our carbon and water cycles back into balance, and restore biodiversity.
Well, excellent. And I'm sure your book will go a long way to contributing to this discussion and spreading the word. The book is Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World, with Judith Schwartz. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.